hello everybody. Welcome to Fak'ugesi Online 2020, Power to the Pixel. My name is Natalie Paneng and I'm the Fak'ugesi Online host, and welcome to yet another live stream panel. The topic of our panel today is digitizing African immersive stories. And on this panel, we're going to be exploring the mechanics of the rich oral traditions alongside immersive and interactive technologies. We will explore how traditional content can be reconstructed and how the essence of these traditions can be applied to create digital stories relevant to Africans. So chairing this panel is Kanda Kinshish from AnimationSA. And before I hand over to Kanda, I would like everybody to make use of the chat box, the chat option, to ask any questions they have during the panel. Any comments, you can direct them all there. And once we're done with the panel, we will use the questions and pose them to the relevant people. So yes, welcome Kanda. I am handing over to you. We're super excited to have you as the chair of this panel.
Thank you so much, Natalie. Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm really excited about today's panel because we're kicking off a new direction in terms of AnimationSA strategy. So today's panel is brought to you by AnimationSA's Human Capital and Innovation team, as well as Goethe's CAV Platform, and of course the wonderful team at Fak'ugesi as well. Thanks so much for allowing us to participate in your beautiful festival. I've looked through some of the lineup and yeah, just amazing artists and ideas. It's a very exciting time, I think. Okay, so this dialogue is the first of a series of discussions that we plan to have with digital artists around transformation. So at AnimationSA, we're expanding our definition of transformation. So we're looking not to just expand the workforce demographic and transform that, but also to look at content itself and decolonialize content and try and see what we can do to facilitate finding an African signature for content that comes from South Africa and also from the rest of the continent. We're quite actively wanting to network with artists from elsewhere in the continent. We're also looking at transforming the entire economic ecosystem around the creation, management, and monetization of the intellectual property. So that's more on the business side. There's obviously we think about creating these products and we look at the artists, but sometimes, especially when you're immersed in digital art, you forget about the sound people and the distribution people and the post-production people, the technologists that work behind it, the computer scientists, the people who distribute hardware and software, the economists who are working hard to create programs to incentivize upliftment in this sector. So today I've brought together some amazing panelists who I will introduce shortly. So our idea behind this particular topic was to look at, we have so many examples of traditional African stories that have been told in a linear fashion. So there's a number of companies who have tried to bring traditional African stories to the big screen, to the small screen in a linear fashion. But we all know that what's happening around the world is that there is a fast development in the field of VR and XR and AR and 360 film, and there's lots of technologies out there that really lend themselves to the immersive and interactive nature of African storytelling. And I feel that as Africans, because of this rich oral tradition, we perhaps even have a head start in terms of creating stories and content for these new technologies. And also there's a social aspect in terms of perpetuating the benefits of having the interactive and immersive storytelling of old and bringing that into the new digital world, that the whole world's inventing itself in the digital space right now. So I think it's a very good time for us to be having this discussion. So the panel today want to unpack this topic, and we want to see what challenges they've faced. What opportunities there are around this, and also want to take a little bit of a dive into what sort of support is available and what's happening on the technical side. So I'm about to introduce the panelists, but please bear that in mind when you're asking questions. There's lots of juicy stuff to unpack here. So our first panelist, Melissa Lela, who I believe is well known in VR circles, and I believe it's a fairly small industry currently in Southern Africa, and she's coming to us live from Nairobi in Kenya. She's an illustrator, independent animator, researcher, and e-learning specialist. And she has been focusing her work on how to digitize works of African origin and how to contribute to the safeguarding of intangible cultural heritage. So Melissa's been working on a number of award-winning projects and taking a deep dive into the technology side of things, as well as the storytelling, attending storytelling festivals around Africa. Melissa, what inspired you to take on this work?
Right, so thank you so much, Kanda. To answer your question, what inspired me to to get on this journey, first of all, is just the passion for storytelling. From a young age, I heard stories, I was told stories by older people, and the methods in which the stories were told were always so engaging. You're told a story, and as an audience member, you also engage in the storytelling experience. There's a lot of, back and forth, a lot of story co-creation happening. And when I was, when I started working as an animator, my first experience was working on the children's series, Tinga Tinga Tales. And this was really my first engagement of, or my first interaction with these stories told in the film media as animated, in an animated format. And the stories were drawn from, they're all based, the Tinga Tinga Tales stories are all based on African folktales. And even the aesthetic style that was pursued was based on an African art style, the Tinga Tinga art style. So it was very beautiful to see how the stories could be told on the screen. And later on, with my ongoing postgraduate research, I've been thinking about the gaps in terms of how the story is being told in linear media, and also the opportunities in terms of how the stories can be told in other media like VR to fill those gaps. How can you recreate this interactive session where it's a call and response scenario and not just a linear interaction or just sitting passively and watching the experience unfold on screen? Yeah.
Great, thank you. Next up, we have Francina and Saman. She is an inspiring economist who works for the Gauteng Department of Economic Development currently, and has been spearheading some really groundbreaking programs in terms of supporting the creative industries, and has been quite key in terms of starting conversations at a high level to really kickstart some amazing initiatives that have been happening in the sector. Francina, you've been doing this for a while and your experience is quite broad. What project do you feel you're most proud of?
The project I'm most proud of is the incubation programs that we've managed to implement with various incubators across Gauteng. We have about 3 of them. It's the South African Creative Industries Incubator. We have the Johannesburg Chamber of Commerce Incubator, and we have Maxim Digital. And those are the programs that I'm most proud of because they have allowed us to implement the concept of industry development within the creative sector. And if you look at the history of the creative sector, it's been mostly political. You know, the sector is ailed with politics and things that really don't matter. But when it comes to the development of companies, SMMEs, studios, record companies, nobody actually sat down and developed a plan and said, okay, there are companies within these sectors, and although they are called entertainment sectors, but there is a lot of revenue being generated, and most of the revenue that is generated is then exported. So then if it's being exported, it means we are investing more in foreign entertainment than we are in local entertainment, because the sectors had become so political and nobody had been sitting down and actually trying to span how do we then implement industry development the same way that we would in mining, the same way that we would in construction, in the steel industry. It is no different. It is an industry, the creative sector, in all its facets, in all its disciplines, contributes a lot to the GDP of this country. So if we do not develop it, then we are going to be stuck with youth unemployment for 10, 30, 40 years to come, because it is the one sector that is able to eliminate youth unemployment. So basically my incubation programs are the ones that I'm extremely proud of.
Thanks, that's fantastic. And it's really good to see how I'm seeing on our AnimationSA social groups, how people who have participated in the incubators are starting to put their art out there, starting to understand how to market their products. Yeah, it must be really rewarding to see people who didn't previously have access to market or business skills, how they can, how they're starting to put themselves out there and show their work.
Truly is, Kenda. It truly is, because you know what was hurting me the most is that the sector was not understood, even from a basic point of what is an SMME within the sector. You know, so we had to go and define those concepts. We had to then, you know, motivate so hard for programs to actually take place, because animation, VR, they were extremely ununderstood. Gaming, you know, the application of those formats in education, for example, we've got kids that are studying textbooks and they are studying characters and stories that have got nothing to do with them, you know. So it really is rewarding. It really is rewarding.
Great, I'm looking forward to hearing a little bit more. And for our audience, we really wanted to help those of you who are aspiring to get your content into the market and wondering how to monetize it, to understand what opportunities there are for you. Great, thank you, Francina. And our last panelist is Daliso Ngoma. Daliso is an entrepreneur in the technical space. He has a company called Technopreneurs. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And they are bringing all the AR, VR, 360 camera hardware into the markets in South Africa. So he has a great view into what the uptake is in this technology, what the latest advances are, and how and what that could potentially look like in the future. If you're wondering also what's happening elsewhere in the world, he has a network and a view around the world of everything that's happening in this sector. So thank you so much, Deliso, for joining us. So you were studying software engineering in Malaysia. What year were you studying? What was happening in the world when you were learning this technology?
Yeah, so hi everybody, my name is Daliso. When I went to Malaysia, that was 2011. So it was actually quite interesting because 2011, even up until 2015, Malaysia also had its own sort of political uprising, similar to, I think, what we're even seeing in the States. So yeah, it was an interesting time. As in, I think if I were to think about Malaysia in comparison to Singapore, the one joke was that most of the development would actually happen in Malaysia and then get exported to Singapore because there's more stability. But it came with the sense that you found people who are quite nimble, who are able to think quite fast, and I think even being quite diverse. So funny enough, I think I met more Africans in Malaysia, even though, for instance, I've been like South African, met quite a few in the SADC region, but quite a lot of them, be it that they were from the west of Africa, the east of Africa, the north of Africa, and then obviously the south of Africa. So that was, I think, one of the things I'd actually say came out of being in Malaysia for the 4 years I was actually studying.
Interesting. And then you're a South African man, and you have also amongst, it must be very time consuming being an entrepreneur in this space, but you've somehow found the time to host and co-organize the We Are VR Josie meetups.
Yeah.
So how long has that been going for?
So I think that's been going for ever since I think around 2018. So the thing is that life is quite serendipitous. I think quite a few people know of Brian from Black Rhino, but it's just a case of he's one of the people in the community, and I'd actually just joined as a co-host because of Eden Labs. So funny enough, Eden Labs were one of our few customers that actually bought, yeah, I've actually got one of them here. This is Oculus Go. So this was early 2018. They bought like around 40 of them. I was actually keen on trying to figure out as to who else is actually in the space. And then ever since then, we literally just have been having a meetup every last Thursday of the month. So it's been quite consistent. I think it's only December's that we just don't have. But as I think you all know, we do have COVID. So we are in the process of actually having our meetups in Altspace. So funny enough, Melissa was actually there with us. This was last Thursday, if I'm not mistaken. So that's where we literally just meet up and join a whole lot of like-minded people, even people who don't even know much about XR as a whole, and getting them to actually connect with a variety of people. So that extends to even having our WhatsApp group and even the Facebook community, just to try and get more people to connect the dots. I think it just does get quite hard. I think my sentiment is that we are located on a farm, which is like 20 kilometers away from any of the main city areas. So that's just one way to actually connect the community.
Great, thanks so much. All right, so because we're going quite deep into this topic, today we're going to let each of the panelists just present for 10 minutes what they've been up to and their thoughts about this topic. And feel free to post questions as you go, and we'll pick them up and address them at the end if you haven't had a chance, or if your question hasn't been answered in the course of the discussion. Okay, so
Kanda, who would you like to go first?
Oh, sorry. I think my internet connection wobbled for a bit. I was saying, Melissa, if you're ready, we'd like to start with you, please.
Oh yeah, sure. So I'll just go ahead and share my screen. Hi everyone. So I will be presenting just a bit from my own experience regarding African oral storytelling and using new emerging technologies to try and recreate this beautiful, rich oral tradition in VR space. If I was to tell a tale, I would, start at this point. I'd ask a question, hadithi hadithi, to which you would respond, hadithi njo. This Swahili phrase and many other kinds of story starters or story openers are often used to do more than just address an audience and also to attract attention. They transport you to a time and place in which a story takes place, and also that is different from your daily preoccupations. So the storyteller's question, in this case, hadithi hadithi, story come, is affirmed, and the correct response, hadithi njo, uongo njo, utamu njo, you can say translation there, reinforces this idea of a shared culture and also creates mental immersion. And all sorts of stories would be told during such settings, an evening gathering around a warm fire, oftentimes targeting younger audiences. So this is really within the context of orature, which, is stories that are passed on via the spoken word and are often based in the spoken language, and they come to life in this kind of rich, lived communal experience. I came across this really good quote from the Encyclopedia of African Literature, where they define it, or they talk about the situation where community life fades away. When community life fades away, orality loses its function and dies. It needs people in a living social setting. It needs life itself. And like many people who engage with new media, I think about storytelling a lot, more specifically storytelling within the context of new and emerging technologies, about finding the space for retelling traditional African stories, including folktales, myths, and legends, using media like VR and virtual humans, and also creating new immersive storytelling experiences that embody cultural storytelling traditions. So a question I get asked quite often is why VR and why virtual humans? And there's more than one response to this question. The first is a very obvious one. This is a practical need. African oral storytelling is very interactive, it's very performative. And these technologies like VR and even virtual humans possess unique affordances that enable this kind of interaction and immersion in the virtual environment. The second response is a bit more nuanced. The stories that we try to tell as Lesser Stories, which is the company I co-founded, they take place in stories and situations that most people have very limited real life experience with, and a very limited first-hand experience with. And because they might have a challenge with imagining these settings or imagining people in environments that no longer exist, or even the people themselves in those kind of spaces, the virtual environments that we create try to mimic, those old environments, so that the user is quickly immersed in this storytelling session and environment. And I look at traditional African storytelling, and from my perspective, I feel like there's three main defining features, which I think, when I think about critically, provide a very solid framework for remediation in VR, even using virtual humans. And these include the oral delivery, because it's largely told by word of mouth by the storyteller. And in many cases, it's also the musical accompaniment. There's a bit of singing that will be used to enhance aspects of the story. So during a storytelling session, I've attended a number of live storytelling sessions where storytellers, like the group in Kenya called Zamaleo Act, they try to really keep alive this oral tradition of storytelling. And you observe that the storyteller sort of presents like a bare afternoon story and sort of gauges who the audience members are. And then they adjust accordingly to who the audience is and create a beautiful story as a result. And then the other feature is the non-verbal aspects of storytelling, which are part of the performance. These include things like the gestures, the facial expressions, the body movements that are often used to describe emotions in the story or even mimic the characters in a tale, with a lot of exaggeration, of course. And then thirdly is this idea of shared communal experiences or participatory experience. This implies a kind of a collective event where the audience congregates, to listen, participate, and share ideas with each other and also with the storyteller. So it's very much a two-way experience, not so much a one-way experience when you're sitting and watching. You're also taking part as an audience member. So the audience, as an audience member myself, I have participated in such sessions by asking questions, by exclaiming, by laughing, responding to what the storyteller has said, making comments, and responding to challenges that sometimes are posed by the storyteller. Kind of a call and response situation, pretty much like what I said in the beginning with the Hadithi, and Hadithin Joe. You respond to what a storyteller has said or what's happening during the session. And another question that I've been asked, why not just read about the stories in books? That's sufficient, right? Or why not just do 2D or 3D animation, something for film or to be watched on TV? Now, there is a challenge here regarding trying to document this kind of story experiences in linear media. And this is not really a new observation. I came across this very old article from a book by two ethnographers who were doing the study in 1920s in Zambia amongst the Lela-speaking people. And they observed something quite interesting from the storyteller who's on the left, who's called Lela. And in this excerpt on the right, it states that one listens to a clever storyteller. Here was no lip mumbling, but every face and body spoke. A swift gesture, often supplying the place of a whole sentence. The animals spoke, each with its own tone. The deep rumbling voice of Momba, the ground hornbill, for example, contrasting vividly with the piping accents of Sulwe. These were the observations, but they conclude that it was all good to listen to, but impossible to put on paper. So, and this is really where VR and virtual humans, I believe, or digital beings come into play. Virtual humans essentially are nothing new. These are, they range from the simple bodiless chatbots that we use a lot to non-player control characters or NPCs in games, to more intelligent embodied characters that look, sound, and behave like people. And the creation of more advanced digital beings oftentimes bring together many other fields like computer graphics, animation, cognitive science, psychology, and more basic systems can actually be built also using game engines like Unity and Unreal. And when coupled with other systems that allow for speech interaction and also for real-time animation, and sometimes even for generative story creation. So for oral storytelling, we envision these virtual beings as virtual storytellers who possess the ability to interact with the player, you as a player in this VR space. They acknowledge your presence, and by acknowledging your presence, they bolster this sense of presence and immersion in the virtual environment. And when there's more than one virtual being present in the environment, they also give a heightened sense of communal experiences, which is very important for oral storytelling. So with this kind of virtual beings or digital beings, in research, they have a super long name, embodied conversational agents. I hate using that word. Or ECAs, if you come across that word, that's what they are. The characters in the VR space, they look at you, they can react to what you say, and more sophisticated systems can even do a lot more interactions with the user in this case. So this experience is so much more different from just reading a book or watching a film. Regarding VR, VR does a lot of what many media does. But then it goes even further. It has so many more attendant features that enable additional interactions via verbal and non-verbal interactions. So this includes things like speech interactions with the virtual characters, the branching and non-branching choices for generative storytelling. If you want your stories to, every time somebody watches this experience, they have a different story outcome. The other is the physical interactions with the virtual objects. On the screen, you actually see an example from our project where the player, you as a 6-year-old child, you can play and interact with the physical objects, with the virtual objects in this virtual environment. And then the other unique feature with VR is, especially with social VR, is this idea of group listening and group telling in social VR environments. And the other very interesting thing with VR is the idea of virtual roleplay. You can become another character who is also part of a story being told. And this is something I've also observed with many live storytelling sessions where the storyteller invites audience members to become characters in the story, and they play along and they follow along what the storyteller says. The last thing about VR, they call it the empathy tool. is this idea of embodied experiences and altered perspectives. You get to see a lot from another person's perspective because you're embodying another character. In our experiences, like I mentioned, you're a 7-year-old child and you're seeing from the eyes of a 7-year-old child visiting this village environment and hearing stories and taking part in storytelling experiences. So now I'll briefly talk about the project that we're currently working on, which is titled Sigana Tales of the Wino. And this project emerged winner in the EXA category for the Digital Lab Africa event. And when we started working on this project, the idea was really just to tell fun stories celebrating African origin and African culture. And the more we shared this work with people, the more it became apparent that the work had potential to further other causes as well. So for this project, Sigana Tales of the Wino, we created a virtual being who serves as a storyteller. And like the West African griot or the Jali, through her travels, she collects fading and forgotten stories, and she's eager to preserve her heritage and the ancient traditions of oral storytelling. So she shares these tales with you in an immersive VR experience where you can participate in timeless storytelling rituals as a 7-year-old child. The first storytelling session is really broken into 3 short tales, which is a proverb, a myth, interspersed the proverb, a riddle, and a few songs. And the stories are really about, like, there's a myth, there's a legend, there's a fable. And all these 3 stories were drawn from one community in Kenya, but the idea was to show the repertoire of sample stories that can be told in VR. So on a final note, I'd really just conclude where I started with the first image in my first slide. There are many, many stories that can be told in this form in VR. And we're only just getting started with this one experience on Sigana Tales of the Wino. We are also creating like this 3D models and environments that are based on archival material that we collect from online archives. And the idea is really to try and stick to this material as accurately as possible, recreating the environment, recreating the objects, and also compiling some of these digital assets to share with other content creators who would wish to get started on this journey of making such stories for VR. So thank you so much. I have to conclude by saying the third Tinder, that's compulsory. Otherwise the story hasn't ended. So third Tinder, thank you.
Thanks so much, Melissa. It's so fascinating what you're doing. Can you hear me? I'm getting a message.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, thank you. That's amazing work you're doing. So have you been testing your product or your content with people who haven't experienced VR before?
Yes, absolutely. It's interesting you asked the question because we had a chance to present this work at Africa Crossroads last year. This work was partly funded by HIVA Fund to the Cultural Heritage Seed Fund. So we, showcased the early prototype of the project to a mixed audience. We didn't have anyone less than 10 years old, but those people between ages 10 to like 30 plus. Now, what's interesting was the kind of questions that we're getting. Those who had more experience with VR were asking the technical questions. They were asking, things to do with the environment, things to do with the artifacts in this space, also about the kind of stories that we're telling. And those who had limited experiences with VR were focused more on the technology. So like, what can I do with my hands? What can I grab? There's really this desire to do a lot within the virtual space. The moment they had the controllers, they look at the hands and like, oh, I am somebody, I have hands. What can I do with these hands? What can I grab? Can I touch the other characters? Can I talk to them? And that was a very short snippet where it ends with the storyteller asking them to say who they are. And those who had very limited interaction with VR were so eager to interact with the virtual storyteller in this manner.
That's fantastic. So they immediately were immersed in the world and keen to participate.
Indeed. Yeah.
That's great. And I imagine, I'm a producer, so I put together teams that create content. And I wouldn't know where to start recruiting a large team to put together this kind of content. There are, also working on AnimationSA's education programs as well. We're trying to imagine what sort of careers there will be in the future and what jobs we can create and what skills will be required. Having created this yourself and a lot of this content, what skills would you say are most important?
Well, so animation is very important, and I guess this is a bias because I come from an animation background, but that made a lot of things very easy. And 3D animation is, 3D modeling, 3D animation is really important as well. So my background was in 2D animation, and I had to learn a lot of the skills required to model the characters, to rig the characters, and to work within like a game engine to make these characters respond appropriately. And that again moves on to working at this, another environment that is not what animators often do. So it's like crossover skills in game design, sort of like animation for game design, working in game engines, like Unity or Unreal is quite relevant as well. And in there, you want to be able to program as well. So dexterity, with a couple of programming languages is equally important. And this is, for many artists, they sort of want to move away from this idea of programming and leave that to the techies. But I feel when you're engaging in this kind of work yourself, you're a techie as well. You need to understand how to organize a logic regarding how this work can be implemented. So that's an important skill to have as well. And because VR is like just an umbrella that has so many skills within it. And the most important skill, of course, is storytelling, because you can have a beautiful experience that really doesn't tell much of a story, unless that's deliberate. But if you're telling a story, the ability to tell stories is just as important as well. And that means researching, that means being observant, that means just really being able to test what you're creating and ensure that it resonates with the target audience. We have a program at the university where I teach, where it's just like an umbrella term, interactive design. And this program usually changes a lot to reflect what's changing in industry, because we say we're training for the future, but we really are not sure what jobs might exist in the future. They don't really have defined terms. Right now, there's a focus on AI, machine learning. And as designers, you're questioning, yes, I need to acquire these skills as well, because if I'm going to make a virtual human, a digital being, and it's going to have like this level of intelligence, I really have to understand machine learning and AI as well. So, and these are skills that, you might not learn at an institution, but then there's a lot of resources elsewhere that you need to keep up with to just build your skill set.
Great, thanks. And I imagine that the storytelling itself, because most people who are trained in storytelling are trained to work within the 3-act structure. And this is a non-linear form of storytelling. So I imagine we need to develop ways to train or even just facilitate a brand new process in terms of storytelling, especially in terms of African storytelling. And so one thing that inspires me is the idea that as Africans, we can potentially reinvent storytelling, but inspired by a long tradition of storytelling, and reinvent it for this technology.
Absolutely.
Great, thanks. And so, Francina, if you're ready, I'd like to move our discussion towards how people can access programs that can assist them in building businesses and economic activities around this kind of content. Are you ready to go?
I am ready to go.
Great.
All right. So hi, everybody on the platform. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Francina and Saman. I'm an economist and a sector specialist responsible for creative industries. And I am based at the Gauteng Department of Economic Development, and I work under a chief directorate called Sector and Industry Development. Melissa, I really enjoyed your presentation. It was really awesome. It was nice seeing African characters, and it was really great seeing the different applications. And I'm hoping that, you know, with the help of our programs, we will get there. We'll have our own little pipeline of African stories being told and interacted with. So, you know, my part in this panel is just to give an outline of what is happening on the government side of things. So digitizing immersive African stories is something that is extremely close to my heart, simply because I have a daughter. And in the world that we live in right now in South Africa, there's very little in animation that my daughter can actually relate to. She recently asked me for a pair of VR glasses, and I was like, what do you want to do with those things? And I just realized, you know what, she doesn't have to be that old to know what VR is and to know the different applications. So I'm sitting with a 12-year-old that has demands, you know, in VR, and I need to make a plan as to how this is going to happen. So in terms of the how part, you know, we had to sort of come up with a process flow for ourselves in the department when we developed the strategy for the Gauteng animation industry, you know, and the first step obviously being finding indigenous storytellers. Gauteng is not necessarily an indigenous province, right? We are a province of immigrants from all the other provinces. All the villages are somewhat outside of Gauteng, and what we have in Gauteng is what we call townships. But those townships also have some sort of a culture. They have a way of living, you know, they have some sort of an indigenous way of interaction, and those stories have not been told. And even the stories all around our villages and rural areas in South Africa have not been told. And the second step would be then to create scripts from those stories in indigenous languages. So I love indigenous languages, and I love the translation, because in South Africa, we have 11 cultures, right? And in those 11 cultures, we are still a bit divided, because Francina is sitting here, she's a Tswana girl, and she doesn't necessarily know how to speak Xhosa. No, neither does she actually understand what the Xhosa culture it composes of. She's only gonna find out one day if God, you know, allows, and she marries a Xhosa man, and now she's stuck in this culture, and she's never had a tool to actually learn what Xhosa culture is actually all about. And even with our children get to school, and they get to, you know, interact with children from other tribes and nationalities, and there is no tool that teaches them how to interact. And for me, you know, digitizing African stories through animation and VR is actually the answer to some of these things, you know. Investing in character development, you know, a lot of our children are interacting with characters that do not look like them, right? They do not have an afro, they do not have dreadlocks, they do not have bald heads, you know. And when they get to school, they then get to this criteria of what your hair is supposed to look like. And hence now we have this whole drive on natural hair and what natural hair is, how to take care of it and all of that. But our kids get to learn that quite late. And again, there are tools that can be used in schools for them to actually, you know, start to interact with themselves. On a physical perspective, what do I look like? I am brown, I've got black hair, and I've got beautiful coils. And then the other issue was learning how to create commercial content, you know, commercialized content in terms of animation, gaming, and VR, content that can be consumed nationally and globally, you know, and then underpinning all of that through content and capacitation of studios. And we do that through incubation programs and technical skills development programs. And then you'll see my line at the bottom. It says, but first we need to find the products in our villages, townships, rural areas. And the best way to do that is through engagements with radio stations. Now, I don't know those of you that are South African or that have been in South Africa for quite a number of years. If you remember, well, some of the community radio stations have a series, it's a soapy, and it has particular episodes that take place on a daily basis. And these episodes are narrated in a native language. So they will either be done in Sotho or in Ndebele or in in Zulu or in Xhosa, and you have the storyteller on a commercial radio station and they're telling the story, and you get people that engage and actually listen to these stories, and the listenership of the radio station then starts to go up simply because of these audio and recorded stories that are being told by indigenous storytellers. So then in terms of, digitizing cultural content, the best practice that I've seen is through animation, gaming, and VR. That's the best way we can digitize our cultural content, because then it gives it a lasting effect. Our libraries right now are having a problem in terms of preservation of content within libraries, because they've never converted the content into a consumable product that can be adaptable, over time. So they've never done that. So we're sitting with a whole lot of library archives in our libraries, because nobody has bothered to digitize the content and put it in a format that is easily adaptable. The issue of educating the nation on different cultures, I've touched on that, enhancing storytelling skills with our kids. Melissa, I loved your presentation, because I loved the idea of the story being a generational asset that is actually transferred from generation to generation. It's the same thing that is happening in South Africa. You get a lot of formats. Jazz music is the best example that we can give in this instance. Jazz is actually transferred from generation to generation. There are certain artistic skills in craft as well that are transferred from generation to generation. But then again, there is no methodology to capture those learnings, to capture those designs, and to digitize them in an adaptable format. And then there's the issue of technical skills development. What I love about the animation industry, gaming and VR, is that the skills that are within these particular industries or sub-industries, once you provide someone with those skills, they can be employed anywhere around the world. And that is the power of the technical skills development skill set within these sub-industries. And then obviously we're gunning for job creation through studio growth, and our studios are not going to grow until we have a good pipeline of products. And that good pipeline of products, the best way to dig out for it is through digitizing cultural content. And then there's the attraction of foreign markets as well, because it was so interesting how Black Panther just blew up after people had told us that African content is not that attractive. And now Disney is mining stories in South Africa, and they're mining stories in Africa. So clearly Africa is attractive. So, that attraction of foreign markets, we need to now catch up and start telling our own stories before the world tells them for us. And then how do we do this as the Gauteng Department of Economic Development, guys? So we started in the animation industry in 2018. I was perplexed by one particular experience. I had to sit down with Nick from AnimationSA and Isabel, and I'm really grateful to them for the time that they spent with me teaching me this industry. And I was perplexed by a couple of things, I didn't understand why I was buying frozen bed sheets, and I didn't get why I was buying frozen cubs like in Pick and Pay, and I just didn't get it. I didn't understand why Mickey Mouse was all over the place in Edgar's. I was just not understanding. This thing is a movie, so how in the world am I now walking into EdCon and I've got t-shirts, tights, gloves, jerseys, all of that, bedding in all these characters? What is happening? And I had to sit down and really dig into this industry, and I came to understand that this industry is one, if we get it right, we can eradicate youth unemployment in 3 years. That is my projection, and I believe in that projection. So we had to start with an overview of what this industry actually looks like. What is it? Who is in this industry? Who are the education institutions? Who are the government entities that are supposed to be taking care of animation? Who are the broadcasters that are supposed to be commissioning work? Who are the studios that are producing work? Are they 2D studios? Are they 3D studios? Do they do both? Which industries do they service? How do they interact with the global market? And where are we in terms of intellectual property development? And also in terms of skills development, how are we doing in that area? And we found that the most difficult thing to do, or actually the barrier in animation, is access, right? Access to funding for products, access to funding for skills, access to funding for development, and access to the world, because the broadband infrastructure in South Africa kind of sucks. We're so behind. So because the broadband infrastructure is so bad, it makes it very difficult for a lot of studios to do their work. So we did that analysis and we started looking at different stakeholders. What was a concern to me in this part is that there was a strategy that was developed in 2014 and never implemented because there was never a department that was commissioned to take care of animation. So if you look at, for example, your NFVFs, your DACs, your DTIs and all of them, there is no department that actually has a mandate for animation. So then we, as the Department of Economic Development, are like, okay, there's a gap here. So let's jump in and see what we can do. And we then started liaising with different stakeholders, AnimationSA being the biggest stakeholder we had. And this was the issue, unpacking the animation industry value chain. And having to unpack this value chain, you know, in some industries, the value chain is longer, but then it can be achieved in a shorter space of time. So from the time of concept, from concept inception to marketing and distribution in other industries, the span is a bit shorter. That is why they're able to introduce new products on maybe, let's say, every 6 weeks. But with animation, you know, the value chain takes a bit longer, right? And we had to understand that because the value chain takes a bit longer, we can't exactly hurry for a return on investment. So the investment in the sector has to be constant without rushing for the end part, because the return on investment is quite huge, even though the value chain itself can take time, you know? And then there was a huge break in the value chain where we've got the broadcasters that are just not coming on board. So our studios are struggling, you know, selling their IPs and trading with studios overseas. By the time they are done, they own less than 2% of their intellectual property. And that was a bit of a problem for us as well. So then we had to also look at issues of, you know, the global animation industry. How do we fare? You know, there are industries that are service destinations. There are others that are content IP, you know, generating countries. And we found that some of our studios are able to make content with content developing nations, you know, and studios in those nations, and they're able to service them. But my concern was still, when are we going to have our own intellectual property? When are we going to have our own stories that we are telling overseas? We then went through a whole lot of challenges, which I've listed here. You know, it's a whole lot of challenges that we went through. You know, we engaged with a lot of studios, with AnimationSA, education institutions. And the most interesting here was the funding for IP development, right? Which was at the time standing at 1.8 million for 2D and 3 million for 3D animation at the time. We have not yet reworked these values as yet. But now here's the problem. If you are telling me that I need 1.8 million for 2D animation, and the only amount of content development funding that is available in the country only amounts to 250,000 rands, we will never be able to develop content. We will not even be able to start. So that is why we put together incubation programs, because as part of the incubation program, there's content development. That is how we were able to bridge that gap. So then we also had to deal with challenges for post-production houses. And here it's mainly the lack of skills, you know, that is there. I remember the last time we had visitors from Canada, and they were hosted by the NFVF, and these guys were just looking for, you know, a computer generating studio in South Africa, and they had been trailing all over simply because there's no database. Simply because there's no place where they can go and find a database of skills providers, studios with the type of skills that they need. And then obviously there was the rebate challenge as well. I think a lot of you on this platform are familiar with the rebate challenge, where the tax rebate takes a long time to be paid out, whereas you need to get into production right now. So it's a whole lot of challenges that we had to then navigate around, you know, and also the type of opportunities that we identified. You know, the opportunities in licensing and merchandising are crazy. If you get your character development right, and you get your storytelling right, and you get your characters that are able to relate to the masses, then, you know, the licensing and merchandising becomes quite easy. You know, then we started getting into gaming and virtual reality as well. You know, we started touching down there, but we're fairly new in this era. We still have a long way to go and we still have a lot to learn. We know a lot, but in terms of development, I think our programs need to now start venturing out and catering for gaming and VR as well. So our areas of intervention are just, they are simple, really. They are, you know, we have an intervention for research, right? Last year, we conducted the first market intelligence research report for animation, and we also want an animation database interface, right? I do know that AnimationSA has one, but AnimationSA has a national mandate. I wanted a database for Gauteng, something where, you know, like an online interface where my studios and students and schools and the entire industry can just engage on that particular platform, and they can also be accessible to everyone else outside the country. And also the idea of supporting industry bodies. We have a tendency as government to set up industry bodies and just walk away and hope for the best. You know, there's a lot that needs to go into supporting industry bodies. We need to support them because those industry bodies support SMMEs that are represented by them. And then we also had some market access interventions that we drew up. So, and there was also the issue of access to funding, right? We had to then bridge that gap as well because animation is expensive. In order for a studio owner, an IP owner to retain their entire IP or at least 80% of their IP, they need major funds because the co-production treaties were not exactly working in that, you know, in that era or in that area. They were not really working at all because South Africa tended to invest less than other countries when the co-production treaties were signed. So the agreements on percentages of who invests what, if you are in a country where we are investing 40% and Germany is investing 60%, the German production company will own more of the IP than our South African studios. So that also needed to change, you know. So we were very successful in establishing an animation and gaming incubator. We have done this through 2 incubators, actually. We've done this through Maxim Digital, which is part of the Innovation Hub, and we have done it through JCCI, the Johannesburg Chamber of Commerce. Now, the incubators are not the same. One is an export incubator, which is the JCCI incubator, and the other incubator is purely a development incubator. So you have to go through Maxim first before you can go to JCCI, because by the time Maxim is done with you, you will have a product that is good enough for JCCI to commercialize. We are still at the point where we're struggling with infrastructure support. My vision here was the idea of taking a government building, having it renovated, and let all the studios sit in one building, because we were missing out on international contracts, both from a GGDA side and from a studio side. I've had studios that came to me and said, Francina, I have, you know, a commitment from India. I have an offtake agreement from India, but the problem is that I cannot show them that I've got 350 animators sitting on a line and I can produce 52 episodes at the amount of time that they require me to. But if you can help me and group us all together as animation studios, we could actually take advantage of this opportunity. So we've missed out on so many of those, and we are on our way to actually making sure that, you know, this cluster actually exists, because we need this cluster to exist. We need to brand it. We need to turn it into a special economic zone where, you know, the cluster itself has, you know, pays less taxes. You know, you will have the same benefits that all the other SEZs have, you know, in that regard. So we are working on our best, you know, to make sure that that happens. So yeah, basically that's our plan, Kanda. That's the plan from our side.
That's so inspiring, Francina. Thanks so much for sharing that with us. I'm sure everyone can agree that if this is the kind of impetus and energy we have coming from the government sector and the economists, we're guaranteed to succeed. I liked your ideas as well of bringing in writers who are drawing from traditional and indigenous stories, who are currently finding their audience on radio. I don't think it'll be very long before they'll be finding their audience on other platforms too. I'd like to move along to chat to Deliso, who can perhaps give us some insight into what's happening in terms of uptake of those platforms, and how people are responding to the technology and the availability of the technology. Over to you, Deliso.
Okay, can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Awesome. Okay, so as you already know, my name is Daliso Ngoma, Managing Director of African Technopreneurs. So my slides would necessarily just correlate on my brief history in XR, and I think like with Kanda and what she's actually introduced as to the movements in South Africa, at least from my perspective. So now, moving right along, I think I always just like to have this slide up, and this is the slide that we usually have even with our meetups, is what is XR? So firstly, you've got real life. Real life would obviously be your eyes, what you see around you. Augmented reality would pretty much be like a mix between augmented reality and mixed reality. So I think you guys can already see the AR filters that we've got on our faces. That'll be what's being augmented into the real world. And then last but not least, it would be virtual reality. So I think for quite a lot of you, if you haven't experienced virtual reality, I'm hoping that one of these days you can. So at least you actually get the same sort of fulfillment that we are talking about right now with the talks. So just to give a brief as to what African Technopreneurs, what do we do at African Technopreneurs? We're focused on XR. So this is primarily through sales. So sales of actually hardware, rentals. So pretty much people do rent cameras and the hardware as well. Software development, so the likes of like AR, a bit of VR as well. And then also training. So be it that is training how to use the devices, or even necessarily getting people to be trained using like 360 videos in the headsets. Now I'm just gonna get to the problem statement of how I actually got into this space. So when I got back into South Africa, this was in 2017, it was early 2017. I was necessarily looking for a place to stay in Joburg. So I was actually staying with my parents for the time being, and I wanted to look for something. So I think with most people, it's either that you go into Gumtree or Property24 or any of these other places where you're trying to look for rentals, but you always just see a particular view of the place up until you go there, and then it's a different story. So that moves me on to, I think I'll just stop sharing quickly, which is this little camera right here. So this was actually my very first 360 camera, which was the Xiaomi Mi Sphere, or actually Xiaomi Miyaji Mi Sphere camera. The funny thing is that because I'd actually been selling 360 cameras before, or actually Xiaomi products, so their power banks and their cameras, it ended up actually correlating to the fact of brand presence and actually trusting in a brand. So even though they're Chinese, it was a no-brainer to actually get the camera. And then actually, let me just get back onto my slides. What I necessarily wanted to do was now offer this as Google Street View, but obviously indoors. So I think for anybody who is actually watching, you might actually be able to see as to where Fak'ugesi could have actually happened this year, but unfortunately so, it didn't. But that's literally what the camera could do. And the nice thing with the camera is that you could even narrate, because you could actually record in real time as well. So getting on to the whole aspects as to the VR market, at least from my perspective, and this is actually a quote from Ulriko, who's the founder and CEO of Habitat XR. Our predictions were wrong. A year ago, we were saying that VR equipment was not going to be a mass consumed product, and the speed of adoption has been amazing. So this brings me to the fact of, I tried to sell this idea to the real estate agents, they were not buying it. So I ended up actually just spinning up a store. We actually do sell through Takealot, Macro, and a few other places to actually get this hardware to the masses. So as you can already see in the picture, this is actually one of our mainstay brands. And funny enough, the story of how I even got in contact with them was that I just sent them an email to say, guys, I would like to sell your products. That went through a back and forth. There was a local reseller, but then they finally actually decided to just go directly with us. Now, talking about VR, the thing that really opened up my eyes into the space is that, funny enough, I started with a 360 camera before actually getting into virtual reality. But I think I'll just stop the share again and actually just show you the headset for anybody who hadn't actually seen this. So this is typically what you see as a virtual reality. It's, yeah, the technical terms for 3DOF, 6DOF, but all you need to know is that if you're trying to get into VR, this is most likely the device that most people get into. The thing that really opened up my eyes with this is that, firstly, it was way cheaper than getting like a Samsung phone and a Gear VR. It was probably more convenient compared to like your Google Cardboard, because the only problem with the Google Cardboard would be that you need a phone and you also need the cardboard. And I think there was less likely a chance, at least on our side, that people would want to steal something like this because it's still quite niche. Compared to like a phone, if I had my Samsung phone there, someone could actually just snatch it and the likes. But I think that is very portable. All you just need to do is just load your content on here, and then you're pretty much good to go when it comes to 360 content. And I think it was also one of those things where initially when I bought the units, funny enough, we're actually selling quite a few of them. And I didn't actually spend that much time in the unit, but it was just one weekend. I got into it enough and I was in like a zombie shooter. So obviously, I think in relation to what we're even talking about in terms of heritage, you can see the landscape where quite a lot of the footage is actually shot in 360. So I think if we're talking about archiving information, hopefully YouTube will still be around for the next, I don't know how many years, but at least if you want to replay that same sort of footage, you can actually find it off of YouTube. And then let me just get back onto the slides. And now, if we're to look at the VR revenue growth in South Africa, so if we're looking at the consumer content market value, it's said to be around 455 million by 2021. It could actually skyrocket because of COVID, but we obviously have to just try and see how this actually plays out. Obviously, that piece of information at the bottom is a bit of a joke, but definitely affects maybe Q3 of 2022. Now, this is where I end my presentation, but getting into what we've actually even got here in South Africa. So I think quite a few of you might actually know about Eden Labs. They've actually recently developed a VR headset, which is pretty much similar to the Go, but more for consumption in the likes of your museums, maybe in terms of, let's just say, architecture, even for real estate, that you can actually hold it by the handle, and often you can put it on your face and you can see around you. And then after you're done, you can actually just hook it back down onto it. So if I were to necessarily look at all the hardware solutions, this has been, I think, probably one of the most unique. Most of them actually require you to put on a strap and everything, and it actually became quite a bit of a nuisance. And especially with quite a lot of big hair, I also have my hair out and about, and it just becomes frustrating trying to put on the strap. So I think for those short tidbits of information that you want to just grab, you can actually use something like the Eden Snacker. And if you want to know more information, you can go onto their website, which would be madebyeden.com. Then obviously getting into education, I think as you all might know, there was the whole discussion of textbooks. I think behind me, there are quite a lot of books as well, but it would have been great that, for example, growing up, being able to engage with the content as it stands. The one thing that actually happened, I remember in high school, is that we're supposed to dissect a frog, but because a few people got squirmish, we never actually got to dissect those frogs. But the main fact is that if, for example, you could actually do it in VR or actually augmented reality, you can still get that same sort of view without necessarily having to even harm anybody or any animal in the process. And then even moving into your museums and exhibits, where, for example, if, for instance, we're talking about trying to archive history, with quite a lot of the developments that have actually been happening right now, it'll be great that you can even pick up your phone, point around, and see history play back just on your device. So if you guys don't necessarily know, there is the Tomorrow Gallery in Rosebank, where you can necessarily take one of the iPads, or even, for example, having the virtual reality headsets there to actually engage with the content that we've got about. So I think with what the two previous speakers had already spoken about, it meshes in quite well that we can necessarily develop this ecosystem and even get it into the African context of what we're trying to achieve. And then this will be my last slide as to what exactly pushes me every day. So I think the one thing that I saw, this is late 2019, as in this is a tweet from the City Press saying no degree, no job. About 56% of 7.6 million South Africans who are unemployed in the third quarter of the year do not have a matric qualification. And 34.1 only have a matric certificate, according to the figures in the latest QLFS. So I literally just put out this tweet to say, we're hiring, no degree required, and drop your CV at my email. The thing that actually spurred the whole idea was that I really want to solve problems. And the thing is that I think in South Africa, it's a very unique situation where we've got high amounts of unemployment. On my side, especially even with my journey when I was in Malaysia, the one thing you realize is that you didn't necessarily have to get a degree in order to actually learn quite a lot of the technology. So I think Melissa had actually even brought it up with learning 3D. For myself, I necessarily got an iPad. I was really interested in actually wanting to program for it. And literally, I went onto YouTube, actually not YouTube, it was, I think, the iTunes library. And I was able to go through a Stanford course that taught you the basics from the beginning till the very end about iOS development. So within African technopreneurs, I've actually hired 6 people. And quite a lot of them have never necessarily touched the same technology that we have. So like, for example, Sammy, he is one of the people who works with me. And he's been with me ever since 2018. That he knew nothing about 360 cameras. He never necessarily used a MacBook, but he was necessarily willing to actually learn that. And the myth is that he didn't necessarily have a degree to actually get into that. And the nice thing as well is that he actually earns whilst he's actually learning. And that's, I think, even the ethos that we just tried to carry through is that if you can necessarily learn and earn at the same time, that'll probably be the most happy outcome overall. And then obviously, I think just getting to the contact details, anybody who's keen to link up with me, it'll be daliso@africantechno.com. Our website would be africantechno.com, the storefront 180by2.co.za. And then obviously the XR community of really trying to get like-minded people into connections around the world would be wearevrafrica.com. And then, yeah, last but not least, I didn't put it here, it'll be Twitter. That's also been an avenue for me to open up to the worldwide market, where, funny enough, quite a few people who are located in the States actually do send messages to be like, hey, what exactly is actually happening in South Africa? Knowing that, for example, I also share quite a lot of VR or XR content. And that's just been a way of how can we actually bridge the gaps to make sure that Africa doesn't get left behind with this new opportunity that we just have coming for us. So that would be the end of my presentation, and thank you all for listening.
Thanks so much, Daliso. It's really inspiring what you've managed to achieve. I love the story about you wanting to distribute products and being nervous about the possibility of getting an answer to your email. You know, sometimes I think we do kind of, as Africans, suffer from a kind of feeling not good enough, you know, like we're going to be ignored. But actually, we're open for business. And if there are opportunities out there that you can sense, the lesson in that is to take it with both hands.
True. Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry.
No problem. You can continue.
So I wanted to ask you about platforms as well. Like, where are people accessing this kind of content?
So it's a bit of a sad story. I think Facebook has its own controversies, but Facebook is probably, I think, the biggest front runner when it comes to where people consume their media in terms of VR. Apart from that, you do have HTC, but they are very small. And I think when it comes to the cost of the devices, it actually gets quite big. Apart from that, I think if we're looking at a free or cheap solution, it will be the Google Cardboard. So at least with that, you can use any device, and you can actually get into the likes of YouTube to actually experience quite a lot of the 360 content. So I think if you're looking at consumption, it's primarily Google, Facebook, Google through YouTube, then Facebook through obviously their Oculus platform, and also through Facebook itself, where quite a lot of people can still put their videos, where it's also ambisonic, so you can actually hear audio from different locations as well. So I think hopefully that actually answers your question on that front.
It does, thanks. The other thing I wanted to ask was around, obviously if we're creating beautiful stories, as Melissa has been doing, where there's an immersive experience with such important cultural transmission, that the ideal place, especially since, these devices aren't everywhere. So for me, my ideas around it would be to install these kind of things at museums and in shared community learning spaces. Do you find that there is demand for these products from the museums, libraries, archives industry?
So funny enough, yeah, with the museums and the likes, there has actually been quite a bit of interest. I think with the UJ Library, they might actually have one of our HTC Vives. We donated a unit for them to actually use. But there has been a bit of an uptick. I think when you look at B2B or industry with the likes of mining, that has actually been quite attractive, with people actually really wanting to get quite a lot of these units for training purposes. But yeah, it's a slow but sure progression. We are also just trying to get ourselves out there by going to schools and universities to try and expose them to the technology. Because I think the unfortunate part with, I think, virtual reality, augmented reality gets away with it, where you can just point your phone and you can actually see whatever's there. But with virtual reality, it's one of those things where you have to see or get yourself immersed to actually believe what exactly people are talking about. Else, for instance, it seems all good when you can see it on like a flat screen, but it actually just makes more sense when you've got the headset on and you can actually feel the 3D presence of the environment that you're in.
Absolutely. So Melissa, do you find where you are in Nairobi, is there a demand for these kind of products from that sector in the libraries, museums, teaching, education? I know you also focus on e-learning as well.
Right, so I wouldn't quite say there is much of a demand. It's more like you have to create that demand for yourself, like by approaching some of these cultural institutions, or like talking to schools, for example, about showcasing the work in those places. But for the kind of work we're doing, there isn't. It's growing. This is like this kind of content is still very. There aren't many people who are making this kind of content. This like what we're doing at the moment, but there are other groups of people, for example, Black Rhino VR, who are making amazing 360 video experiences, and they're like people you look up to, like they have something that's working, a model that one could borrow, and one you could talk to them about seeking advice about what would be like a viable business model to pursue. For instance, thinking about things like location-based entertainment. But in terms of demand, I think it's growing because largely, our experience, for instance, you need to have an Oculus Rift, or a Quest or a Vive to watch this experience. And this is like on the higher end of VR equipment. So it's not so much something you can watch as a 360 video, because that would be something you can even do just on your phone and watch on YouTube, for instance. So there's that sense of not many people, like the numbers, people who have this kind of headsets to watch this experience. There are not many people, so you can't really target that as a main market. And the business would be more like targeting, approaching more like a location-based entertainment model, where you work with the cultural institutions, the galleries, the libraries, the archives, and museums, and try and make content that's relevant for them as well, and they want to showcase your work. So it's still there, it's still new, it's growing, but there's interest. People who are like, yeah, when you approach these institutions and like, this is interesting work, we'd like to see more of it, how can you showcase it? And how can we address this kind of infrastructure gaps that we are experiencing in our institutions? And then about e-learning, this is interesting because, again, right now with this COVID situation, many teachers are just getting into online teaching, and they're starting from the basics of multimedia content production. They're learning about creating videos. They're learning from basic tools like making things like simple voice over PowerPoint presentations to just basic audio editing. And VR is like, not even within the range of things I think about, but because I've given workshops in this regard on using, moving from like the whole range of multimedia tools, from just basic audio to all the way to AR and VR. And when presented with this kind of content, they're like, this is a unique way to teach other content, but then it's difficult for me to make VR content. It's difficult for me to make AR content. And but they appreciate the value of this in teaching and learning. I gave an example demonstration where we got this video off of YouTube of solar system, and the teachers were like, this makes sense, because when I draw the solar system to my students in class, they just see a couple of circles, but they have no spatial awareness, they have no sense of space, you know. And when they watched the VR experience, you know, with the headset, it was actually a video off from YouTube, a 360 video. They're like, this would make so much sense to my students, to resonate with them very well, and they'd understand the concept, you know, very quickly. So there's an opportunity there, but the issue is more like the skill gaps. So teachers would not inherently be the people who make this kind of content on their own. They would need other, you know, experts, so people who work in VR to also supplement the skills and work together with them to make this kind of resources.
Great, thanks. And I'm aware that our time is slipping a little. So I just have one more question quickly for Francina. Are you seeing scope for collaboration across the creative industries? So across the music industries and the tech innovation industries. Are you seeing scope for that?
Yeah, yes. So we focus on, there are 4 sub-industries that we have, okay, well, given that, okay, for me, animation, gaming, and VR are a group. So that's one group. And then we've got music, and then we've got film, and then we've got craft. And I chose these ones particularly because of their multiplier effect in employment, firstly. And secondly, the fact that there's zero development happening. There was, in 2015, when I came into, you know, the creative sector, there was zero development. The incubation programs were not making sense. Nothing was making sense to me. So we can't sit with sectors that have such a potential for high growth, and especially with the element of eradicating youth unemployment, but there's no development happening there. So I did not understand. So those are the sectors that we have, and I'm really just focusing on development within these sectors, because we don't want to lose the mark, right? You look at what happened with Jerusalem. I mean, that guy, that song went bananas. It went bananas. Now I'm thinking it could have been even cooler if it had an animated video. Like really, we could have sold a character there. If we had just merged a couple of industries together, we could have sold a character. So yeah, we're looking at all 4 sectors and how we can actually get them to, you know, correlate, because it's an ecosystem at the end of the day. You know, you're dealing with an ecosystem, but this ecosystem has pieces. And if you don't get all the pieces right, you put a puzzle together and the ecosystem is not going to work. So yes, we are focusing on other industries as well.
Oops, I was on mute. Great, thank you so much for that insight. I think I'm hoping that the audience that are listening, both now and later, are feeling inspired by the opportunities. There is a wealth of content that can be created. There are amazing new technologies and a vast number of skills that will be required to create the content that we will need to create a body of work from our corner of the world that will hopefully become a global sensation and will have an economic knock-on effect that will uplift all Africans, not just South Africans. So I'm feeling quite inspired by this. So I'm aware we don't have very much time left. I'm not seeing any specific questions coming through. Oh, there's a question. Platform cross-continent, is there uptake and consumption of the VR, AR, MR kind, or statistics that we can watch for growth? Deliso, do you want to field that one?
Yeah, I can field that one. It's just that I think quite a lot of these companies have been shy about their numbers. Just to give you perspective, Oculus had said that their pre-order sales had gone up by 5 times the amount that they had sold in the opening session, but they didn't tell us what the numbers were. So the things that I think that only just gives us perspective as to how many units were being sold, but it also does touch, like, for example, some of the guys who've been in the space. Just to give context, I think this was around 2018. Facebook had actually said that they made around $100 million in terms of sales when it came to software. So if you're looking at 2018, now we're actually in 2020, I presume there might actually be a huge jump. So the thing is that the consumption is there, but I think, like what I alluded to, is just to try and provide the railroads and even the trains for people to actually try and get themselves to actually use that. But in terms of statistics, yeah, it's going to be a bit of time. All that I can actually just share is that it's also the same thing with PSVR. They were actually one of the forefront runners when it came to virtual reality. Just from their sentiment is that they're saying that it's not their main focus. This is PlayStation. So instead of actually releasing a PSVR solution, they are now looking at releasing it not this year, but probably in 2022. It might come sooner, but that's just, I think, this is the sentiment. But in terms of specific statistics, I would not necessarily have anything as it stands.
Kenda, can I assist?
Yes, of course.
So I think it's Flora Mati Okuku, I hope I pronounced that correctly. Please go to the PricewaterhouseCoopers website. There is an entertainment and media outlook that they release annually, which measures the consumption of animation, gaming, VR, television, music, and a whole lot of others, film, cinema, and they do it across a couple of countries. So it's South Africa, it's Ghana, it's Kenya, it's Nigeria. So just go to PwC, www.pwc.co.za, and look for Entertainment and Media Outlook Report. They release them every single year, and then you'll be able to get the statistics you're looking for.
Thank you so much, Francina. That's very valuable. I believe we're running out of time, unfortunately, but to the audience and the panelists as well, if there are any questions that you would like to ask, we are going to be chatting about this online. We'll be posting it about it online. The wonderful Goethe-Institut's CAV platform is working closely with us. So we'll be posting after this session and writing up about it. So please get in touch, watch us on social media. I have a slide here. Sorry, bear with me. I hope you can all see it. Can you see it?
Yes, we can. Is it a PDF? So we just have to hide the thumbnails.
All right. Okay, but you can see it. I don't know. We'll go with that. Yeah, I just want to take this opportunity to thank, first of all, the Goethe-Institut for partnering with AnimationSA on this journey of exploring how we can boost the industry, transform the industry, and Africanize our content that we develop in this country and on the continent. I'd like to thank the tireless team at AnimationSA, my colleagues there, for all that they have done and continue to do. Also, of course, would love to thank our wonderful panelists for taking the time to come and talk to us and help us unpack some of these conversations, and for the insights that you've shared with us. and the team at Fak'ugesi as well. Tegan and Natalie have been absolutely wonderful, so thank you too. And last but not least, I'd like to thank our audience. Thank you so much for joining us and for joining in the conversation.
Okay. Could I just add one more thing? For anybody who has a Snap camera or Snapchat, search for Power to the Pixel. So at least you can also get one of these.
Thanks very much, Deliso. That's really helpful for us. Thank you, Kanda, for bringing this panel to us through the festival. It's been a really entertaining conversation, and so exciting to see someone like Melissa, who's actually been on so many of our other bits of programming through the Digital Lab Africa program, and great to be connecting with you. And also Deliso, who ran their We Are VR program with us. They have a monthly meetup. Please go and join that if you're interested in VR work. This is really, really interesting, and I look forward to building these conversations with you further. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Tegan.
Super. And there were lots of like high fives and hellos from the Facebook side, but no direct questions. So I think we're good. Thank you very much.